They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But in my experience, it's best served at 3 a.m. with the rhythmic beep of a tow truck and the sweet smell of a petty tyrant's world falling apart. You know, most people think they're buying a home when they sign those papers, but what they're actually buying is a seat in a high-stakes poker game where the house always tries to cheat. And in my case, the house was a pack of HOA wolves led by a woman who treated a cul-de-sac like her own personal kingdom. My name is Miller Vance, and before all this madness started, I was just a guy looking for a little slice of the Ozarks where the only thing I had to answer to was the wind through the pines and the occasional grumpy badger. After 30 years of running a heavy-duty excavating outfit in Chicago, the kind of work that leaves your joints creaking and your patience for bureaucracy at an absolute zero, my wife, Sarah, and I decided to cash out and find our, forever quiet, We found it just outside a place called Silver Creek Springs, Missouri. It was 12 acres of heaven that shared a border with a pristine new development called the Heights at Silver Creek. But here was the golden ticket. My property, specifically the 400-yard access road leading from the main highway to my front porch, was legally carved out of the original ranch back in the 70s. It wasn't an Oppos, T part of their subdivision. It wasn't Oppos, T subject to their bylaws. And most importantly, it was mine, and I'd paid a staggering $65,000 premium just to ensure that, private, meant exactly what it said on the tin. Our first year was blissful. Just the sound of gravel crunching under the tires of my old Ford, a sound that, to me, was the literal heartbeat of freedom, until the day I met Brenda Vance. No relation, thank God, but she was the kind of woman who wore, president of the HOA, like a military rank and looked at a blade of grass over 3 inches as a personal insult to her dignity. Brenda drove a Lexus the color of surgical sweet and had this way of smiling that didn't and Oppos. T involve her eyes, just a sharp baring of teeth that told you she was already calculating how much your existence was costing her property value. She cornered me by my mailbox one Tuesday, her perfume cloying enough to kill a wasp mid-flight, and told me with a chilling cheerfulness that my, rustic, driveway was an eyesore that didn't end Oppos, T align with the aesthetic vision of the Heights. I told her as politely as a man with my temperament can, that my driveway was my business, and her vision ended exactly where my property line began, but Brenda wasn't in Oppos, T the type to take no. For an answer, she was the type to see it as a challenge. 2 weeks later, I woke up to a sound that sent a cold spike of adrenaline through my chest, the low, guttural growl of a paving crew and the acrid, choking stench of hot tar. I ran out there in my boots and boxers only to find a team of guys laying a thick, black ribbon of asphalt right over my beautiful, expensive gravel, and when I screamed at the foreman to stop, he just pointed a greasy thumb toward Brenda, who was standing on the sidewalk with a clipboard, looking like she'd just conquered a small nation. She had the audacity to hand me a community improvement assessment, for $4,500, claiming that since my road connected to theirs, it was now a common thoroughfare, by necessity, and she'd already filed the paperwork with a cousin of hers who worked in the county clerk's office to have it redesignated. I remember standing there, the heat from the fresh asphalt radiating up into my face, and feeling a level of calm, cold rage that I hadn't in Oppos, T felt since my days on the construction sites. I didn't in Oppos, TL anymore. I just looked her in those dead eyes and said, Brenda, you've just made the most expensive mistake of your life, and she just laughed a high, brittle sound and told me that, progress waits for no one, Miller, What she didn't in Oppos, Tino, and what people like her never seem to realize, is that when you spend 30 years in excavation, you don into Oppos. T just learn how to move dirt. You learn where all the bodies are buried, metaphorically speaking, and you develop a very specific set of skills regarding permits, drainage, and the absolute sanctity of a deed. My road wasn't in Oppos, T just a road. It was a legally protected easement with, in perpetuity, clauses that a Supreme Court justice couldn't and Oppos, T wiggle out of, and Brenda had just committed a felony of property destruction and trespassing under the guise of, beautification, But But the asphalt was just the opening act of her play, and as the days turned into weeks, the harassment turned into a coordinated siege. She installed, in quote, residents only, in quote, signs at the mouth of my driveway, hired a private security firm to patrol in a golf cart, and actually stopped me on my own land to ask for my ID to, in quote, ensure community safety, in quote. Sarah was a wreck, her quiet garden sessions ruined by the constant hum of Brenda's, in quote, beautification committee, in quote, who would walk past our fence line with clipboards, pointing and whispering like we were some kind of exhibit in a zoo. Our daughter, Maya, who was home from college for the summer, couldn't and oppose to even have friends over without the security guard hovering at the end of the drive like a vulture. That's when I called in the old guard. I reached out to an old buddy of mine, Silas, a retired surveyor who could find a property pin in a hurricane, and a guy named Elias, a private investigator who specialized in, end quote, corporate irregularities, end quote, while Brenda was busy posting photos of our, end quote, non-conforming, end quote, mailbox on the neighborhood Facebook group and inciting the local Karens into a frenzy of digital pitchforks. Elias was digging into the finances of the Heights at Silver Creek. And boy, did he find a gold mine. It turns out Brenda wasn't into oppos. Just a bored housewife with a power trip. She was a failing real estate developer who had leveraged the HOA's reserve fund to buy up the 3 lots surrounding my property through a series of shell companies. Her plan was to flip the entire corner into a high-density, in quote, luxury villa, in quote, complex, but the bank wouldn't into oppos. T approved the final loan without, in quote, unobstructed, paved access, in quote, to the main highway, and because my road was in the way, she decided she would just steal it, pave it, and use the county in oppos, its own bureaucracy to, in quote, absorb, in quote, it before I could figure out how to fight back. She was bleeding money, paying high-interest bridge loans with HOA dues, and she needed my road to be her, in quote, public, in quote, thoroughfare to save her from total bankruptcy. The turning point came when they tried to break my spirit through the one thing I love most, my peace. They started, in quote, emergency drainage repairs, in quote, that conveniently required cutting off my water line for 48 hours at a time. And when I called the county, they'd tell me the permits were, in quote, pending, in quote, or, in quote, lost in the system, end quote. Brenda would see me in the driveway, look at my wilting rose bushes, and say with a smirk, in quote, it's a shame about the infrastructure, Miller. Maybe if you just cooperate and sign the easement over, we could get this all resolved, end quote. I remember sitting on my porch that night, a single lamp burning, looking at the, in quote, residents only, in quote, sign at the end of my road, and I just started laughing. I realized she was playing checkers, and I was holding the board. I didn't end oppos. T need to sue her for the asphalt. Not yet. I needed to let her think she was winning, so she'd keep digging her own grave. I told Silas to resurvey the land, but to do it at night, and I told Elias to follow the money all the way to the county commissioner's office. The finale started on a Saturday in July, the kind of Missouri day where the humidity is a physical weight and the air is thick with the buzz of cicadas. Brenda had organized a, and quote, community unity barbecue, in quote, right at the junction of my road and the subdivision, essentially setting up picnic tables on my property to celebrate the, in quote, grand opening, in quote, of the new thoroughfare. She was there in a sundress, holding a glass of Chardonnay, telling everyone how she'd finally, in quote, civilized, in quote, the wild corner of the neighborhood. I waited until the speeches started, until she was mid-sentence about, in quote, shared values, in quote, and, in quote, community vision, in quote, and then I rolled out. I didn't end oppos. T come alone. Behind me was a fleet of 4 heavy-duty tow trucks I'd hired from a company 3 counties over, guys who didn't end oppos. T give a damn about local HOA politics. And right behind them was the county sheriff and 2 agents from the State Bureau of Investigation. The look on Brenda's face when the sheriff stepped out of his SUV was something I'll cherish until the day I die. It wasn't end oppos. T just confusion. It was the slow, agonizing dawning of total, irrecoverable defeat. You see, while she was busy paving my road, Elias had found the smoking gun. Brenda had forged the signatures on the, end quote, public redesignation, end quote, forms, and her cousin in the clerk's office had already flipped. On her the moment the SBI showed up at his door with a search warrant. But the real kicker? The end quote. Residents only in quote. Signs she put up? I'd used them as the legal basis to claim that she had created a end quote. Private impound zone in quote. On my land without a license. I walked up to her, right in front of all her in quote. Unity in quote. Followers, and I handed her a stack of papers. In quote. Brenda in quote. I said, my voice as steady as a stone, in quote. You're being served for felony property damage, embezzlement of HOA funds, and grand theft. And since this is my private road, and these cars are currently trespassing on a non-permitted commercial thoroughfare, end quote. I paused, looking at the Lexus, the BMWs, and the Autos lined up like soldiers. End quote. Every single one of these vehicles is being towed to an impound lot in St. Louis. It's a 200-mile round trip, by the way, and I've already filed a lien against your development company for the cost of the gravel you destroyed. End quote. The scene that followed was pure, unadulterated chaos. Brenda was screaming, her Chardonnay spilling down her dress, as the tow trucks started hooking up the cars of the HOA board members. The end quote. Community end quote. She'd spent 3 years cultivating turned on her in a heartbeat the second their luxury SUVs were being hoisted into the air. She tried to slap the sheriff, which, pro tip, is a very bad idea in the state of Missouri, and she ended up face down on the very asphalt she'd illegally poured, the plastic zip ties clicking shut on her wrists. But the story didn't end oppos. End with her in handcuffs. It ended with the total collapse of the Heights at Silver Creek's leadership. With Brenda in jail and her shell companies exposed, the HOA's in quote, reserve fund in quote, was revealed to be a black hole of fraud. The bank pulled the loans on her luxury villa project, and because she'd used her own home as collateral, she lost everything. The end quote, beautification committee in quote, vanished overnight, and the neighbors who had once whispered about my quote, rustic and quote, driveway were suddenly knocking on my door, bringing pies, and asking if I'd consider running for the board, as if I'd ever want to join a club that would have her as a member. I spent the next month with a jackhammer and a crew of my own, tearing up every single inch of that black tar. I put my gravel back, real, high-quality Ozark flint that crunches exactly the way a driveway should. Every time I hear that sound now, I think of Brenda sitting in a cell, and I think about how some people think they can pave over the world just because they have a clipboard and a title. Looking back, I wonder if it was worth the stress, the wilting roses, and the silent nights with Sarah wondering if we'd made a mistake moving here. But then I see Maya out there, riding her bike down the gravel without a security guard in sight, and I know I'd do it all over again. There's a special kind of peace that comes from knowing you stood your ground when a bully tried to take it, and if it cost me a few months of my life to ensure the next 20 years are quiet, then at a bargain I'd take any day of the week. So I've got to ask you, what would you have done? Would you have sued her from the start and let the lawyers handle it for 3 years? Or would you have waited for that one perfect moment to let the tow trucks do the talking? I see a lot of people in these comments talking about how HOAs are a necessary evil to keep property values up, but at what point does, in quote, value in quote, become a prison? Is a manicured lawn worth your soul? Or is the right to a gravel driveway and a little bit of privacy the real American dream? Let me know what you think below, because honestly, I'm still not sure if I'm the hero of this story or just the meanest dog in the junkyard. But I do know one thing. Nobody's paving my road ever again.